Well, thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. I have to confess to feeling a little bit like a fish out of seawater, if you pardon the slight pun, in that being an economist amongst a room full of scientists, I believe. Maybe there might be another economist out there, but I'm not sure. So you won't see much technology here. I'm more about the policy than the energy technology. Other thing I would say on the opening slide is that originally this presentation was entitled Energy Intensity Scheme, Policy and the Decarbonisation of Australia's Economy. Perhaps as a testament to the situation in Australia, that was the current policy of the day in March, and that was binned a few months later, and now a new policy has emerged from the government that is designed to address our levels of CO2 emissions. The problem with Australia is that for the last 10 years we haven't really had a coherent energy policy, and the best engineering in the world won't do it for you unless you've got a coherent policy framework put in place by the government. And that is what Australia is missing and has done for about 10 years. The other thing I would mention about this first slide is that this is a joint work with my colleague, once my PhD student, now my colleague, Dr. Shahid Duzaman from QUT. Okay, so I'll begin with a summary of my presentation. Australia accounts for a very small percentage of the world's emissions, GHG, greenhouse gas emissions, about 1–1.5%. But we are one of the highest per capita emitters of GHGs in the OECD. And that is largely because Australia is highly dependent for its electricity generation on coal and gas. Even though we have a heap of uranium, which we export, we don't have any nuclear power stations in the country, and it's not likely to have any in my lifetime. I should go further though, because I'm getting older, for quite some years to come. So, to meet Australia's commitment to the Paris Accord, as I said, the government came out just last month with a new policy initiative called the National Energy Guarantee Policy, which has two components. One is to guarantee security of electricity supply, and the other is to assist in meeting the country's commitment to reduce emissions in line with its commitment in the Paris Accord. The National Energy Guarantee, this current policy, is in fact a de facto energy intensity scheme anyway, and we'll see later why that is the case. The emphasis on the electricity generation and distribution sector is because that accounts for about 35%, a little more, of Australia's GHG greenhouse gas emissions. So if we can't get that right, then we'll have a great deal of difficulty in meeting our 2030 commitment under the Paris Accord. The other thing I just mentioned in terms of the, if I get this point to work, unfortunately I'm sight challenged, so I can't even see where it's pointing. So the guarantee of security of electricity supply, even though we are rich in gas, rich in coal, clean coal as some people call it, uranium, and we have plenty of power from wind and solar, the fact that a lot of our state premiers have embraced quite ambitious targets for renewable energy as the source of power has created a degree of insecurity in terms of supply, and there's been a number of brownouts and blackouts where those should not be happening. So the government is acutely aware of the political backlash of that. So part of this new policy is to try to persuade us, the people of the country, that they can guarantee security of supply, as well as reducing carbon emissions. The technique we're going to be using here today is a technique called decomposition analysis. I'll say a bit more about that in a couple of minutes. But what it basically does is decomposes observed changes in a variable of interest, here it's emissions, into, it distributes that change across the various proximate drivers that are believed to be causing that change. In doing that, we're also going to focus particularly on the contribution that has come from reducing the emissions intensity of energy produced in achieving our overall reduction in carbon emissions. Now, as an economist, economists guarantee ad nauseum to provide lots of graphs in their presentations. I'm not going to provide lots of graphs, but I will provide one. I couldn't be an economist unless I at least provided one graph. Also some equations. I won't actually produce any equations, not like the previous presentation, but there will be an identity which will allow you to understand the method. And finally, there must be a table, at least one table, in any kind of economist presentation, so I guarantee you one table as well. So here's the graph. So my son helped me design these transitions. He's 10 years old. He's much more adept at these things than I am. So this is a graph of Australia's GHG emissions over the last 25 years, back to 1990. That's when the National Greenhouse Inventory allows us to have comprehensive data back to 1990. The blue line is emissions trajectory from 1990 to 2006, and the downward trajectory is what has happened, an apparent trend break in 2006 in our emissions. Our emissions consist mostly of CO2 emissions from energy creation and transport. So the energy comes from coal and gas, and the transport from oil. About 73 to 75% of Australia's emissions are CO2 emissions from those sources. Another 20% from methane, that's agriculturally based, and 4% from nitrous oxide, and the rest from the rest. So, something apparently happened in 2006, but is it going to be long-term in nature? On that, you'll notice back around 1990, there was also a period of declining emissions, which lasted for several years. Regrettably, that was also around the time Australia had its last recession, and it was a deep recession and a long recession. So in other papers that my colleague and I have written, we've written about the effect of economic activity, particularly recessions and expansions, has on CO2 emissions. So I'd be virtually certain that that decline was due to that very deep recession that the country had in 1990, 1992. More recently, there does seem to be a downward trend in our aggregate emissions, although it is a bit of a worry if you look at those last 2 years, a little bit of an uptick in the last couple of years, 2014 and 2015. Is that the start of another trend going up, or is it just a blip and the downward trend will continue? What's also on the slide is the 2030 commitment under the Paris Accord. In words, Australia committed to reducing our aggregate GHG emissions by between 26 and 28% below what they were in 2005. So those two lines down there represent 26% reduction and 28% reduction by 2030 below 2005 emissions. Okay. The method used here today is called decomposition analysis. It's not econometrics. You'll get a dose of that in 2 presentations' time when you will hear all about panel co-integration. Most of my life I have done econometric research, but this is not econometric research. So decomposition analysis is a method, as I said, of decomposing an observed variable of interest, in this case emissions or changes in emissions, into what we believe are the proximate drivers of those observed changes in emissions. So if you have a look at the, these two identities, it allows you to understand what we're trying to do by way of this decomposition method. As you can see, the top identity is just that, it's an identity. If you eliminate all of the numerators, you're left with CS equals CS. So CS is emissions in sector S of the economy, industry S of the economy. So, but by looking at it this way, it gives you some interesting information in perceiving what is driving observed changes in emissions. The variables at the right-hand end, O over P is output per capita or income per capita, and P for population. They're considered the main upward drivers of emissions. As a country becomes more populated, more emissions. As it becomes wealthier, more emissions. So they're the, what you might call, upward anthropogenically sourced drivers of emissions. The other three variables to the left of those, starting with OS over O, that's output of sector S divided by, say, GDP, or the total output of the country. By seeing how that changes over time, you can get a sense of what structural change in the economy is doing to emissions, as you might be transitioning out of more intense, carbon emission intensive sectors into others. The next one is ES is the energy used in sector S over the output of sector S. So that's a measure of energy efficiency. And the remaining one is CS over ES is a measure of emissions intensity. So that's the emissions in sector S divided by the energy used in sector S. So what we're attempting to do is decompose observed changes in emissions into those 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 proximate drivers. The next identity is simply arrived at by aggregating over the S sectors of the economy. So, the way we go about this decomposition is using a method known as LMDI, logarithmic mean divisor index method. I'm not going to go into the mathematics of it for two reasons. It's boring and I'm not really an expert in the mathematics anyway, my colleague is. But I'll give you some intuition. Some of you might be aware of the way price indexes are created. So the consumer price index, you've got a bunch of price relatives of different commodities. They are measuring the price at a certain time and a price at a different time. And you want to get a measure of the average change in price. So you create this thing called an index, which takes those price relatives and weights those price relatives in a certain way to come up with an index. One of the couple of key issues with creating a price index is what weights do you apply to those price relatives? Do you apply the base weight in the first period or the weight in the second period if you're using, say, expenditure patterns of people in terms of where they're spending their money? Or do you use an average of what that expenditure was between the two periods? And if you're going to use an average, do you use an arithmetic average or a geometric average or maybe a log mean average? And secondly, another issue is should you use the simple price relatives or should you take their logs? So, in the decomposition analysis, we actually proceed in the opposite direction. We're not creating an index, we're taking observed changes and then we're distributing those changes according to these proximate drivers that we believe are responsible for those observed changes. So the ones we're interested in particular are energy efficiency and emissions intensity as well as structural change. In this particular method of decomposition, the LMDI, we express the observed changes in emissions in terms of the logs of the observed changes in the drivers, and we use the logarithmic means between the two periods as the weights. So that's why it's called logarithmic mean divisor index. So, now the table I promised. So, this table is the results of doing a decomposition analysis on changes in GHG emissions. The unit of measurement is millions of metric tonnes, or tonnes, if you're familiar with tonnes. of carbon dioxide equivalent and its period averages. Now, we did a heap of work, but we're only going to present a very small section of that here this afternoon. I think it's just gone this afternoon. So, this is the table. We're looking at the period 2006 to 2015 because that was the period that seemed to have that trend break. We're going to look at the contribution of the drivers, so intensity of energy use, that's emissions intensity of energy used. Energy efficiency is the next column. Structural change in the economy is the third column. The wealth effect is GDP per capita, the contribution that has come from that. And finally, population. So, the first point is simply a statistical one, that over that period, those 9-year period, per year on average, GHG emissions reduced by about 8 MMTs, or about 73 MMTs in aggregate across those 9 years. So that's the right hand of that table, the average per year and the sum of those yearly changes in aggregate form in the bottom row. What's more interesting, of course, is what we might conclude brought that about. So if you look at these numbers here, oh, that wasn't the right thing to do, was it? If you look at these numbers here, is it not working? Ah, it doesn't want to look there. Those numbers there, that's, if you add those two numbers up, that gives you the aggregate contribution from those anthropogenic sources of wealth and population growth. So that has contributed, it could have contributed 119 MMTs to emissions that we didn't actually observe that because of the mitigating effects of the other three variables at work. But if there was no mitigation, what the analysis is suggesting is that emissions would have gone up by another 119 millions of metric tonnes. That didn't occur because of the mitigating factors. So that means that emissions could have been 36% higher than they actually were. So in 2006, they were 611.5 MMT, and that reduced by 73.5 down to 538. That's what was actually observed. What could have been observed without any mitigation would have been an increase, not a reduction, of 119 MMT. So a 36% increase over what actually did occur. So the mitigating factors, those three factors over here, that's what produced the overall observed outcome. And that mitigating effect summed to 192.7 million metric tonnes of mitigation to bring the observed emissions down to what we saw. Of those three mitigating factors, you'll see that emissions intensity per unit of energy used was the most important contributor, 110.6. So that's about almost 60% of the total mitigation came from that particular source. It was less so from energy efficiency and less so from structural change in the economy. Over a 9-year period, you probably wouldn't expect that much from structural change in the economy. But nonetheless, there does seem to be some contribution coming from that source. So I think that's it for that page. This allows a very simple scenario analysis, not a forecast, just a scenario analysis with the following shape. If you make a reasonable assumption of about population growth and GDP growth, Australia from 2000 to 2015 on average has experienced 3% per annum GDP growth, and our population on average is projected by the Bureau of Statistics to average about 1.5% over the next period out to 2030. 2030 is the year that, of the Paris Accord commitment. So just in terms of those two anthropogenic drivers, a basic projection would have us have as our baseline a 56% increase in emissions compared with the 2015 emissions. In other words, 838 MMT per year. However, the 2030 target is 442 MMT. We took the midpoint of 26 and 28, that's 27%. 27% below what emissions were in 2005, they were 605 MMT. So 73% of that gives us the 442 MMT, which is the target. So in other words, you need about 397 MMT of offsets, mitigating offsets, if we're going to make that, that commitment to the Paris Accord. And that, because it's a 15-year period, that amounts to about 26.5 MMT per year accumulating, more and more, 26.5 more each year of mitigation. So how realistic is that? How likely is that that we can achieve that? Well, in the table I just showed you, between 2006 and 2015, the sum total per year, average per year of the three mitigating factors, summed to 21.4 millions of metric tonnes. So from 2006 to 2015, on an average, on a per year basis, we observed 21.4 coming from the mitigating factors. The target requires 26.5, which is about 24% higher than what was observed and achieved in the most recent period that we have data available for, particularly that period since the trend break. As I said, of the three mitigating factors, it's reductions in emissions intensity that produced 50% of the total mitigation. So to meet that 2030 target, it would seem that reductions in emissions intensity is going to have to continue doing the heavy lifting. So, turning the page to conclusions, 24% further improvement is quite a challenge. We're particularly concerned about the uptick at the end of that period, the 2013 to 14 and 2014 to 15. Is that going to be a new upward trend in emissions? To go 24% more than has already been achieved in the last 9 years is quite a lift in terms of effort. Emissions intensity, in terms of reductions per unit of energy produced, will need to be a very significant part of the pathway forward. And the government's new NEG policy, the National Energy Guarantee Policy, is designed to do just that. As I said, it has two components, the electricity guarantee component and also the emissions reduction guarantee. So what the emissions reduction guarantee basically amounts to is the government or its officers will determine what the appropriate trajectory is for emissions in the electricity generation and distribution sector, which will, in their opinion, allow Australia to meet its 2030 target. Then it will be the electricity retailers who buy the electricity off the generators to determine what mix they are going to purchase with a view to satisfying their customer base. That not only assures us of guarantee of supply, so it can't all be renewables, because what happened in last year was one state was blacked out for days because it has an overly ambitious target for reliance on renewables without suitable battery storage. So we'll have to guarantee the retailers, there's a number of different retailers in Australia, electricity retailers, they'll have to guarantee supply within various benchmarks for the government, to supply the government, to satisfy the government. At the same time, they will also have to purchase sufficient energy from low emitting sources to ensure that they're meeting the government's requirements of them in terms of that forward trajectory of emissions from the electricity sector. So in other words, it really is an emissions intensity scheme, but being implemented by retailers once the government sets the broad parameter of the trajectory that's required. Well, will we make it? I guess time will tell. There's a federal election coming. Policy in Australia changes almost every election. That's why we're not making too much headway. It's why there's not enough investment in either renewables or in fossil fuel type generators, new generation fossil fuel generators, coal generators, because there's a lack of policy certainty amongst the private sector. There's insufficient investment going into the infrastructure, and so that's what's driving up costs, and it's also driving greater and greater insecurity of supply. So whether we will make it or not will certainly depend on more political certainty, but Australians will need to acclimatise, if you pardon the pun, to the implications of seeking to live in a lower emissions environment. Thank you very much.